September 28th, 48 BC. The coast of Egypt, near the mouth of the Nile, at a place called Pelusium. A small boat is rowing toward the shore, carrying a man who 3 years ago was the most powerful figure in the Roman world. His name is Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. He is 57 years old. His army has just been destroyed at the Battle of Pharsalus. He has fled across the Aegean in a ship with a handful of advisors and his wife, Cornelia, who watches from the deck as her husband climbs into the small boat to go ashore. Ptolemy XIII was campaigning around Pelusium against his sister, Cleopatra VII. Yes, that Cleopatra. Pompey had sent word ahead to Ptolemy of his approach. A meeting of Ptolemy's council debated what to do. Should they drive Pompey away or welcome him? It was argued that neither was a safe option. The former would make Pompey an enemy of Egypt, while the latter could make Pompey the master of Egypt and Caesar its enemy. The council's solution was the one that cowards always reach when caught between two powerful forces: eliminate the weaker one and present the stronger with the gift of his enemy's head. Pompey was murdered by Achillas and Lucius Septimius, former soldiers in his own army, under the orders of the eunuch Pothinus and Theodotus of Chios. They believed Caesar would be pleased by the removal of his adversary. On September 28th, Pompey was invited to leave his ships and come ashore at Pelusium. As he prepared to step onto Egyptian soil, he was treacherously struck down and killed by an officer of Ptolemy. Caesar landed in Alexandria 3 days after Pompey's death. Ptolemy had Caesar presented with Pompey's severed head, to which Caesar turned away in horror. He was said to have become overwhelmed with grief and wept for his one-time ally and son-in-law. The man who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, conquered Syria and Palestine, humbled the kings of the East, celebrated 3 Roman triumphs, and for a decade stood as the first citizen of Rome. This man died in a rowboat, stabbed in the back by someone who had once served under his command, on a beach in a foreign kingdom, his body dumped into the shallows. How do we get from a boy who raised his own army at 17 to that beach in Egypt? That is the story we are going to tell. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus was born on September 29th, 106 BC, in Picenum, in the north of Italy. Born into a wealthy Italian family, he was not of noble birth, but emerged from a background that displayed the dynamic opportunism of a self-made man. His father, Pompeius Strabo, was a successful military commander of the equestrian class. Wealthy, powerful in his region, but not a senator, not a member of the ancient Roman aristocracy that guarded the consulship and the major magistracies for itself. His adversaries gave him the nickname Agilus Sentilis Carnifex, teenage butcher, for his ruthlessness. He had earned it. When Rome descended into the civil war between Sulla and the Marian faction in 83 BC, Pompey was 23 years old. Rather than wait to be drafted or appointed, he did something that had no precedent in Roman history. He raised a private army of 3 legions from his father's veterans and clients, entirely at his own expense, and offered it to Sulla. Sulla's return from Asia in 83 BC regenerated civil war with Gaius Marius' former supporters. Pompey raised an army at his own expense and led it vigorously in support of Sulla. The young general with his private army completed his assigned campaigns in Sicily and Africa with a speed and effectiveness that left Rome astonished. On Sulla's orders, the Senate gave Pompey the job of recovering Sicily and Africa from the Marians, a task he completed in 2 lightning campaigns. Pompey ruthlessly executed Marian leaders who had surrendered to him. When Pompey returned from Africa demanding a triumph, the great ceremonial procession that celebrated a general's victories, Sulla initially refused. Pompey was not a senator. He had held no magistracy. The triumph was for men of the proper rank. Pompey reportedly said, "More people worship the rising than the setting sun." Sulla laughed and gave him the triumph. He also gave him a title, Magnus, the Great. Pompey's early success led dictator Sulla to give him the cognomen Magnus, the Great, after his boyhood hero Alexander the Great. He was 24 years old. What follows is a career that reads less like a biography than like a catalog of impossibilities. After Sulla's retirement and death, Pompey was sent to Spain to suppress a serious rebellion led by the Roman general Sertorius, who had been holding out against the Sullan government for years with considerable success. Despite having no experience as a Roman magistrate, he coerced a command in Spain against the rebel Sertorius, simply through the fear of his legions. He spent 5 years grinding down the Sertorian revolt, and returned to Italy in 71 BC, just in time to intercept the remnants of Spartacus's slave army, which Crassus had effectively defeated but not entirely destroyed. He helped in the slave revolt led by Spartacus around 72 BC. Pompey then claimed to share the credit for finishing what Crassus had started, a theft of glory that Crassus never forgave. In 70 BC, Pompey and Crassus were elected consuls together, a remarkable pairing of two men who deeply disliked each other and needed each other to control the Senate. Instead of opposing Pompey, Crassus joined forces to bully the Senate into appointing the two as consuls for 70 BC. Pompey then lifted the restrictions that Sulla had placed upon the tribunate, which was the people's representatives in the government. He looked to them, and not the aristocratic Senate, for further military commands. This is a crucial detail. Pompey was not simply a military man who happened to be involved in politics. He was a man who understood, from early in his career, that the people were a power to be mobilized, that their support could be bought and directed, and that the tribunate, the magistracy of the people, which Sulla had neutered, was a tool for getting things done that the Senate refused to authorize. Every time Pompey came back from a campaign, he showered the people with gifts. He threw festivals, financed feasts, and even handed out money. This kept the people content temporarily, despite their lack of rights and political power. Then came the pirates. By the mid-60s BC, piracy in the Mediterranean had reached a level of crisis that threatened Rome's food supply. Pompey obtained sweeping powers in 67 BC to eradicate the pirate menace. Based on Cilicia's coast, the pirates had received Mithridate support. Their ranks had swelled with the addition of war refugees. They had 1,000 ships and had seized 400 cities along the coasts and islands of the Mediterranean. No merchant ship was safe. The campaign Pompey then executed is one of the most brilliant pieces of military organization in ancient history. He divided the Mediterranean into 13 zones, assigned a commander and fleet to each, and coordinated a simultaneous sweep that drove the pirates from west to east in a matter of weeks, concentrating them at their last stronghold in Cilicia. What had seemed an insoluble problem that had defeated every previous Roman general assigned to it, Pompey solved in 40 days. Pompey implemented a comprehensive reorganization of the newly acquired eastern provinces, taking into account the geographical and political dynamics necessary for establishing a Roman frontier in the east. The Senate, watching from Rome, was alarmed. A general who could clear the entire Mediterranean of pirates in 40 days was a general who could do anything. And what Pompey did next only deepened their alarm. The eastern kingdoms, Pontus under Mithridates VI, Armenia under Tigranes the Great, had been a thorn in Rome's side for decades. Previous commanders, including the able Lucullus, had made significant progress against Mithridates but had been unable to finish him. Pompey took over command in 66 BC, swiftly defeating Mithridates and reorganizing the conquered regions, creating new provinces and installing client kings. His victory brought vast wealth and glory to Rome and himself, cementing his reputation as the Republic's foremost military leader. Beyond Pontus, Pompey also campaigned in Syria and Judea, where he took Jerusalem in 63 BC. The capture of Jerusalem deserves a moment's attention, because it was an act of spectacular insensitivity that would have consequences. Pompey entered the Holy of Holies, the sacred inner chamber of the temple, where only the high priest was permitted to set foot, out of pure curiosity. He took nothing, but the violation was remembered. Returning to Rome in 61 BC, Pompey celebrated a spectacular triumph that marked the zenith of his fame. His triumph was the most elaborate Rome had seen in generations. 3 days of processions, prisoners, treasures, and spectacle. It celebrated victories in 3 continents: Europe, Spain, Africa, and Asia. The inscriptions claimed that he had added to Rome's revenues from 50 million drachmas per year to 135 million. He had conquered or organized 14 nations, taken 900 cities and towns, and captured over 800 ships. At the end, the globe he carried in his triumph bore an inscription: the master of the sea and the land. He was 45 years old. He was at the peak of human glory, and he was about to discover that glory in Rome was not enough. The Senate refused to ratify his eastern settlements. They refused to grant land to his veterans. When Pompey came back, the Senate didn't want to ratify his decisions or give land to his soldiers. The leading senators, Cato, Lucullus, Metellus Celer, combined to obstruct him at every turn, motivated partly by principle. Pompey had accumulated too much power, and partly by personal resentment. He had displaced Lucullus from his eastern command in a fashion that was politically adroit but personally insulting. Pompey, for all his military genius, was not a natural politician. He lacked the patience for the grinding work of coalition building, the willingness to compromise, the thick skin required to survive daily insult in the Senate without taking it personally. He sulked. He maneuvered without quite knowing what he wanted. And in this vulnerable moment, Julius Caesar appeared. Caesar had already displayed, in his years as a young political operator in Rome, an intelligence and an ambition that matched Pompey's own in a completely different register. Where Pompey was the great general who needed political support, Caesar was the great political operator who needed military success. Each had what the other lacked. The alliance between Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar emerged due to their failure to pass various core portions of their programs in the gridlock state of Roman politics in the years before 60 BC. All three had wanted something but were stymied by their rivals in the Senate and assemblies. In 60 BC, the 3 men formed what historians call the First Triumvirate, a private agreement never officially announced by which Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus would coordinate their actions to get what each needed. Once the agreement was signed, the Senate was forced to obey. To cement the alliance, Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia, a woman 30 years his junior, whom he reportedly came to love with a tenderness that surprised everyone who knew him. Julia became, in the years of the triumvirate, the human bond that kept her father and her husband from each other's throats. For several years, the arrangement worked. Caesar used Pompey's support to get himself elected consul in 59 BC, then to get himself assigned the governorship of Gaul, where he spent the next decade conquering territory that would make modern France and Belgium part of the Roman world, and building an army of veterans who were personally loyal to him. Caesar secured the command of the armies and united all of Gaul and made expeditions to Britain, proving himself a ruthless general, while amassing incredible wealth for himself and the Roman treasury. But the triumvirate was held together by personal relationships as much as by shared interests, and the personal relationships began to fray. Julia died in childbirth in 54 BC. After his daughter Julia died in 54 BCE, Caesar's connection to Pompey grew weaker. Crassus, the third member of the alliance, died catastrophically the following year at the Battle of Carrhae, leading a reckless invasion of Parthia that ended in the worst Roman military defeat in a generation. The triangle became a confrontation. With Crassus dead and Julia gone, nothing restrained a rivalry between the two remaining giants. The Senate, which had always feared both of them but feared Caesar's Gallic legions more, inclined toward Pompey as the lesser of two dangers. He'd also demonstrated that a victorious general with an army at his back could cow the Roman aristocracy. Pompey allowed himself to be elected sole consul in 52 BC, unprecedented, and essentially the power of a dictator with a more constitutional name, and aligned himself with the senatorial faction he had once circumvented. The Senate declared Caesar an enemy of the state. Caesar was ordered to give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen, which would have exposed him to prosecution and political destruction. The Roman Senate supported Pompey and asked Caesar to give up his army, which he refused to do. On January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar stood at the bank of the Rubicon, the small river that marked the boundary between his province and Italy proper, which Roman law forbade any general to cross with armed troops. Crossing it was, by definition, treason and civil war. He reportedly hesitated. Then he said, "Alia I acta est." The die is cast, and led his troops across. What followed was a campaign of staggering speed. Caesar moved south so rapidly that Pompey found himself unable to organize his forces in time. Caesar made early gains in the subsequent civil war, defeating Pompey's army in Italy and Spain, but was later forced into retreat in Greece. Pompey evacuated to Greece, taking with him most of the Senate and the legitimate government of Rome, intending to organize the vast resources of the eastern provinces, which he knew intimately from his campaigns, into an overwhelming force that would crush Caesar's smaller, battle-hardened army. The plan was not unreasonable. Pompey had more men, more money, more senatorial legitimacy. Caesar had better soldiers and a better general. Before the Battle of Pharsalus earlier that year, Pompey had been confident of victory. He confidently replied, according to Plutarch, "In whatever part of Italy I stamp upon the ground, there will spring up armies of infantry and cavalry." Yet though willing to fight under the great Pompey, most of his recently mustered legionaries were raw recruits. On August 9th, 48 BC, the two armies met at Pharsalus in Thessaly. Pompey had roughly twice as many infantry and a massive cavalry superiority. Caesar had veterans who had spent a decade fighting and winning in Gaul under his personal command. Pompey's army suffered some 15,000 casualties, and 24,000 of its soldiers were taken prisoner. Caesar pardoned all his surviving enemies. Pompey fled the battlefield before it was over. The moment his cavalry broke, he rode back to his camp, changed out of his general's insignia into the clothes of a common traveler, and disappeared. Having been defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey fled across the Aegean to Mytilene and then on to Cilicia, where he held a war council with his remaining advisors and decided to head to Egypt, which had provided him with aid the previous year. And so we arrive back where we began. The rowboat, the beach, the knife. Ptolemy, seeing Caesar's rising prominence and hoping to gain his favor, killed Pompey. Despite the enmity between the two Romans, Caesar was supposedly saddened by the death of his former rival. Caesar turned away in horror at the sight of Pompey's head. He was said to have become overwhelmed with grief and wept for his one-time ally. Whether Caesar's grief was genuine or performed is a question that ancient sources debate and modern historians cannot resolve. What is not in dispute is the political consequence. Ptolemy's assassination had deprived Caesar of his ultimate public relations moment, pardoning his most ardent rival. Caesar had been granting amnesty to a great number of those of the senatorial faction in their defeat. Even men who had been bitter enemies were allowed to not only return to Rome, but assume their previous positions. Caesar turned against Ptolemy, sided with Cleopatra, and would remain in Egypt for nearly a year. The war went on. The Republic had one more act to play before it became the Empire. What are we to make of Pompey the Great? The verdict on Pompey's career is divided between claims that both Caesar and Pompey sought the same thing, supreme power, and arguments that Pompey was the last of the Republicans, a man who gave his life for the ideals of ancient Rome. Both arguments contain truth. Pompey was genuinely attached to Republican forms, to the Senate, to the magistracies, to the idea that Rome governed itself through institutions rather than through the will of one man. He wanted to be princeps, first citizen, but not, apparently, dominus, master. There's a real distinction there, even if the line between the two is thinner than Pompey wanted to believe. But he also, throughout his career, operated by means that corroded the republican order he professed to defend. He raised private armies. He used his military reputation to intimidate the Senate. He formed the triumvirate that effectively ended the Republic's independence years before Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Pompey was a man of his own time, reflecting the ambiguous politics of the late Republic, when the institutions of the past no longer proved entirely adequate. Following the example of his father and others, he used his military conquests to influence politics. He was, in the end, a transitional figure, the man who demonstrated that the old republic could no longer function without quite being willing to replace it with something new. He was the last great figure of a world that was ending, who understood that world well enough to succeed in it without understanding that it was over. Caesar, who came after him, was the first figure of the world that replaced it. Perhaps the best estimate is that Pompey was a man of his own time. It is doubtful that he ever intended to replace the Senate as the governing body of the Republic. Still, Pompey's personality, his ambitions, his conquests, and his ultimate position in Roman society undoubtedly played a part in the fall of the Republic. The fall of the Roman Republic is one of the hinge events in world history. The moment when the Mediterranean world shifted from governance by collective institutions to governance by individual power, setting the template for the monarchies and empires that would follow for the next 2,000 years. Pompey did not cause this fall by himself, but he was the man who made it legible, who demonstrated that the old forms had become hollow, that military power had replaced institutional authority as the real source of legitimacy, and that Rome's destiny would be decided not by the Senate's votes, but by the armies in the field. He died on September 28, 48 BC, one day before he would have turned 58. He was murdered by an officer of Ptolemy as he prepared to step onto Egyptian soil. His head was cut off and preserved. His body was left on the beach. A former slave who had served him built a small funeral pyre from the timbers of a fishing boat and cremated what remained. Eventually, a monument was built for him. Rome never entirely forgot the man who had given it 3 triumphs, cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, and organized the East. But it forgot him faster than it should have, because Caesar was more dramatic and more consequential and wrote better. Pompey left no memoirs. The history he made was written by others. He was almost Caesar, almost the man who would remake the world. He was, instead, the man whose defeat made Caesar possible, and whose murder on a beach in Egypt presented Caesar with the severed head of the world they had both tried to inherit and made him weep. Thanks for watching. See you next time with another human story.